Hello and welcome, comrades. The last video on this channel was primarily concerned with why raising class consciousness is a necessary pursuit. It wasn't made to define class consciousness, though. Instead, it might be productive to look at what outlooks and ideologies do not develop class consciousness. With that in mind, this will be the first of a few videos on false consciousness, or political and socio-economic ideas and attitudes that purport to be rooted in class consciousness, but aren't for any number of reasons, and in fact may be deliberately meant to steer workers away from actual class consciousness. Now, I anticipate this video being kind of a longer one, so I've split this video up into chapters with convenient chapter markers and time codes. Today, let's look at the nebulous idea of populism as a kind of false consciousness. It should go without saying that I'm perfectly capable of being wrong. In fact, the ubiquity of populism's adoption as a stand in for class consciousness indicates I am in the minority for suggesting otherwise. I'm not the gatekeeper of what is and isn't class consciousness. In fact, I'd be happy to hear why I'm wrong, so please do comment. So, why would I say populism is a form of false consciousness? A lot of my objection to populism can be extrapolated from the fact that it is ambiguous in its meaning and doesn't have a strong ideological underpinning to it, therefore, leading to numerous political remedies being put forward that are totally at odds by people with divergent understandings of populism. So, what is populism anyway? No matter who you are, pretty much anyone who has heard the word will say it's a political and socio-economic outlook that seeks to emphasize the concerns of ordinary people or common people or whatever other way to describe the people against the interests of the elites. Who counts as ordinary common people and who counts as the elites? Well, being that common ordinary people versus the elites is a dichotomy, it might be nice to apply those labels to proletariat and bourgeoisie as a way of washing off the pretentiousness. Instead of proletariat and bourgeoisie, you could also say working class and capitalist class, but commonly ordinary people and the elites work just as well, right? If a situation calls for saying working class and the elites to better get the point across in a way that is easily accessible to everyone listening, that's fine. It's important, however, that the intended audience of any discussion about class consciousness knows that when you say the elites, what you mean is the class of people who earn money primarily or completely from their ownership and control of the means of production, meaning if they own a business or other property that generates income for the owner. This is in contrast to the working class, which most people will understand that you mean people who earn money by selling their labor to the owning class, or capitalist class or bourgeoisie class, for a wage. It's understandable why many on the left and progressives use populism as their way of communicating class politics. It's more accessible. Most everyone has a way of conceptualizing ordinarily common people and the elites, and won't know what you're saying if you start throwing around words like proletariat and bourgeoisie. But the reason I said it's important to make sure everyone knows you mean the capitalist class are the elites is because while everyone may be able to follow a discussion about regular, ordinary, common people and the elites, there's going to be baggage with those words unless you make yourself clear. Because when it comes down to it, common people and the elites are meaningless words at identifying important dynamics of class politics. You're sure to come across people who, when you say the elites, are going to think of liberal college professors, Hollywood liberals, the liberal media, anyone associated with big tech, Twitter blue checks, and on and on. I guess what I'm saying is the biggest problem with populism is that right wingers exist. While I have much deeper problems with populism that I'll get into later, what I can't get past is that populism, most of the time, is little more than a tool for reactionary movements to steer class antagonism towards their ends. For people like Tucker Carlson, populism is a cudgel. Tune into his show. Is he talking about Frito Lay workers' fight against brutal working conditions? Probably not. When does he talk about Amazon or Jeff Bezos? When he does, it's to point out that Bezos owns the Washington Post, which is an enemy press organization after all, and his issue is primarily political, and any mention of issues related to workers' rights is to paint Bezos, the Washington Post, and liberals as hypocritical in one way or another, as if the Washington Post and liberals were at all interested in class struggle. The most Tucker Carlson considers in critiques of capitalist exploitation of workers is to say Amazon treats its workers poorly and that should change, but how far is he willing to go to advocate on behalf of workers? Jeff Bezos' wealth and exploitation of Amazon workers for Tucker Carlson isn't about control over their work, as you would think should be the populist critique. It's about scoring a political point against a perceived political enemy. Consider this segment from his show.
Well, Amazon, the company founded by Jeff Bezos, owner of the propaganda organ The Washington Post, seems to get more political and more aggressive in its politics with every passing day. It's also getting richer. As small businesses across the country are closing, as an entire sector of our economy, the last independent sector of our economy, has been crushed by politicians, Amazon becomes more powerful. And it becomes more powerful because a lot of people use it, because the service is incredibly convenient. But there are some people in this country, we don't know the full number, probably tens of millions, who prefer not to fund Jeff Bezos' latest super yacht or the government of China by continuing to use Amazon. So I think there are a lot of people out there who know that Amazon is bad for the United States. It's pretty aggressively anti-American as a company.
The first thing he says is Jeff Bezos also owns propaganda organ, The Washington Post, which is obligatory for right-wing populists, even if it's unrelated to the topic at hand. Seriously, it's the first thing he says in a segment about Amazon. The second critique is they are political. Then he says they are getting rich to the detriment of small businesses. Small business is the last independent sector of our economy, as opposed to the elite corporations like Amazon. A few times he brings up that Amazon is successful because it's convenient, which for Tucker is something owing to the company's merit as a well-run business and completely removed from the implications for workers. Tucker is not interested in what Amazon workers have to go through to make Amazon convenient, something he gives the company credit for. Then there's an obligatory shot at China. Amazon is bad not because of how it treats workers, but because it's anti-American, and not anti-American in that its practices are harmful to American workers, but anti-American ideologically. And of all the concrete examples of Amazon being bad, other than its impact on small businesses, is pulling several conservative books. Again, the critique is political and largely not economic. And what economic critique Carlson gives is in defense of capitalists that he likes, and not in defense of workers. In addition to using everyday as one word instead of two, this segment gets almost everything wrong. And to the extent it makes any sort of point even remotely close to an actual anti-elite critique, the critique isn't focused on class struggle. Just to reiterate, small businesses are set in opposition to elite corporations, which is not relevant to class struggle. The dichotomy of ordinary and elite is reduced to small versus big, the implication being that small businesses are similarly in opposition to the same elite forces as workers are. So, in the right wing populist calculation, capitalists are both ordinary people and the elite at the same time. What separates the ordinary capitalist and the elite capitalist? Not only is it about size and amount of wealth accumulated, which are standard populist concerns across the political spectrum, but the politics involved is also important in distinguishing elite capitalists and good capitalists. If Jeff Bezos owned the Washington Times instead of the Washington Post, and if Amazon banned white fragility instead of when Harry became Sally, would Tucker Carlson ever talk about Amazon? One of the biggest problems with right wing populism is the right wing comes into conflict with the populism, and too often the right wing wins out. That's because so much of what defines the right these days is culture war bullshit. If you call yourself a populist, but you're concerned that a movement of workers' rights might include immigrants, transgender people, Black Lives Matter activists, and socialists, you are likely going to side more often than not with the elites as long as they aren't too woke. The totally not fascists Saagar and Enjeti, who actually will on occasion introduce worker struggle rhetoric in his brand of right wing populism, thus giving him cred among some progressives as one of the real right wing populists, still has the typical right wing obsession with cultural grievances that Tucker Carlson has. Furthermore, though he may give lip service to workers' concerns, Sauger still doesn't make a truly class conscious critique of capitalism. Take this video, for example. It's about how Joe Biden, who at the time was just one of many candidates running in the Democratic primary for the 2020 presidential campaign, was making the same Hillary Clinton esque mistake by showing his willingness to sacrifice coal mining jobs for the sake of action on climate change, and by callously, to Saagar at least, suggesting displaced coal miners take up computer programming as a new career. His critique is largely boilerplate populist language without being particularly right wing when he speaks about economic issues. He talks about globalization, outsourcing, the Iraq War, which is all standard stuff for populists of any political persuasion. But would a reversal of globalization and the end of outsourcing really change class power dynamics? Did workers in automotive factories have more control over their work before their jobs were lost as a result of the factory moving out of the country? Not to say that outsourcing is harmless, but it's not the source of exploitation. It's merely a tool. For right wing populists like Saagar, the problem isn't work as something inherently exploitative, it's that some capitalists behave in ways that create worse conditions for workers. And not only is work not inherently exploitative, it's in fact honorable.
The former vice president is, in effect, telling working class Americans that after playing a pivotal role in shipping their jobs overseas, sending their sons to die in war, and presiding over the devastation of their community, that they should then choose to learn to code, which is, of course, the paragon of a good job in today's economy. His answer belies the utter contempt for the dignity of real work in this country. He again sends the same message. Neoliberals place no value in the dignity of work, and that the working class of this country are cogs in a machine willing to be dispersed on a chessboard as to whatever role the elites here in Washington decide is best for them.
The dignity of work. Wow. How populist. Selling your time and productive capacity to a boss in exchange for a fraction of the wealth created by your work, now that's dignity. But that's a standard conservative talking point. It's a feature of the good old Protestant work ethic. Work gives people meaning and purpose, especially if that work makes a man feel like a man. It's the Mike Rowe view of work. The simple man who puts food on the table by working hard, not complaining, and coming home tired yet fulfilled from an honest day of hard work. And as a little aside, a pervasive conception that arises from false consciousness is that manual labor is real work or in some way harder than other kinds of jobs. Coal mining is a man's job that makes you sweat. Programming is a job for beta males for some reason. Maybe because it's big tech. In the populist worldview, even some workers are elites. Generally, Saagar's critique of elite corporations like Amazon is that they are large and powerful and use their size and power for undue and disproportionate political influence. I'm sure he'd be happy for Amazon workers to unionize and get insurance and pensions and other types of benefits. But does he want workers to have control over their workplace? Would he advocate for an economic system that doesn't doom workers should the industry for which they work necessitate being eliminated? Should we just keep increasing carbon emissions so overworked and exploited coal miners don't have to reduce themselves by having to now be overworked and exploited by big tech? What if the coal miners' existence wasn't dependent on how well they were able to sell themselves to a capitalist? But for Saagar, since work gives people dignity, putting food on the table is something earned by hard work and not a fundamental right of being human. Since work is the source of purpose, the only extent he can take class commentary and capitalist critique is to say work should be less exploitative and that corporations, especially large corporations and never small capitalist enterprises, should have less political influence. But what does Saagar want to do about the elites who treat workers like cogs in a machine and have workers dispersed on a chessboard? By the way to overload your point with two different metaphors in one sentence, Saagar. But what does he want to do about these elites that treat workers this way? Without getting rid of capitalism, workers are always going to be at the will of market forces. If government mandates regarding greenhouse emissions don't eliminate coal jobs, what's to stop the market from simply shifting away from coal for any number of reasons, leaving those workers again up to the mercy of the market? And if the job market favors relocation to coding as an option for those displaced coal workers, what is going to save those workers from such an undignified job? Who is to rein in these market forces? And why not just get rid of the market forces instead of needing to rein them in the first place? Ultimately, right-wing populism sounds at times like it's maybe similar to left-wing populism, only with different priorities, but in reality, there's a different motivating drive to the two wings of populism. Right-wing populism is animated by grievance against elite forces, changing what they see as the fundamental makeup of our cultural identity and upending traditional values. A right-wing populist is just as likely to be outraged that Amazon sells a Blue Lives Murder t-shirt as they are to be outraged by working conditions at Amazon fulfillment centers. Because the problem with Amazon to the right-wing populist is that its power, wealth, and influence has been used to drive a liberal left-wing agenda into our politics and harm good old-fashioned small businesses. And the problem isn't fundamentally that it has power, wealth, and influence in the first place. The fact that elite corporations have power, wealth, and influence is the concern of left-wing populists. But a similar lack of real class analysis exists in left-wing populism as it does in the right. Very few on the left who speak in populist rhetoric or who identify as populists, like basically everyone at TYT or Kyle Kalinske or Crystal Ball, etc., ever really challenge capitalists at its core. Capitalism is necessary because, after all, who's going to make shoes? The government? No thanks. The government can do social safety nets, provide healthcare coverage to everyone, regulate industry to some extent, but don't you want the free market to determine what cars get made? Liberals, progressives, and segments of the left that reject socialism or any other post capitalist economy have a narrow vision of what is possible for society. Services are either provided by private industry or the government. The idea of a democratically controlled economy based on worker run and collectively owned industry is outside of liberalism's scope. In this way, left wing populism can only hope to achieve greater union representation with greater rights for workers, more services included in the social safety net, and other such reforms meant to rein in the greatest excesses of capitalism. Left wing populism can't achieve, and doesn't seek to achieve, an end to capitalism. Because what is wrong with our economy today is crony capitalism, late stage capitalism, corporate socialism, which, by the way, isn't a thing, something I'll cover in a future video. Left wing populists have an obsession with greed and corruption. The problem isn't capitalism itself, it's individually greedy capitalists. And how often do you hear about money in politics from these type of populists and from populists of all stripes for that matter? All the effing time. If only we didn't have this system of legalized political bribery, maybe we could get some good politicians in government who are beholden to the people and not big business. What doesn't fit with their worldview is that the state exists to protect private property and serve the interests of property owners. And again, to reiterate vital context, what is meant by private property aren't things like a home or car, rather, it's productive property like a factory or farm or other type of business. The government operates with its expenses paid by taxes. If capitalists control the level of government revenue by their command over the economy that generates taxable income, then it doesn't take much imagination to see how any politician would learn who runs things, even without any campaign contributions being exchanged. The notion of corruption implies something more pure to have been corrupted. It's actually a reactionary tendency that permeates all of populism and not just right wing populism.
I think for me, the new left is a Democratic Party that actually puts the interests of the working class at the center. And the Democratic Party has itself undergone a realignment over the past number of decades, really starting first and foremost in the Clinton era, where there was a concerted push to reorient the party away from its FDR, New Deal, labor union roots and towards this rising professional managerial class. And the type of politics that we get around centering the Democratic Party on the professional managerial class is a politics that puts identity issues and cultural issues above, prioritizes them above economic issues.
It's the idea that things used to be better for workers, but the elites have used their power to destroy the working class. Union representation used to be much higher, and taxes on the wealthy used to be much higher. Increased wealth inequality, massive amounts of debt from student loans, medical bills, and credit cards, the increasing number of jobs people have to hold in order to live, the level of pay for ordinary people falling short of the increase in productivity, these are all social ills that can be tracked throughout recent history. And the trend indicates that things are much worse than they were at some time before the elites took our government captive. So we should return to some previous state of affairs by enacting this or that reform, and a revolutionary shift in society isn't necessary. It's easy to point to the rich as the bad people, which is often the case among populists, especially left-wing populists.
What would define your campaign?
Standing up to the billionaire class.
Billionaires, 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 billionaires.
I am not a billionaire.
Millionaires, 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 millionaires and billionaires at the same time.
Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaires and billionaires.
Millionaire and billionaire. Millionaires and billionaires. Billionaires and millionaires.
Billionaires.
It's a minor point, but wealth is only a small portion of class politics. What is more important is ownership and control of productive private property and the power that comes with it to hold captive the means by which people earn their living. Granted, the richest people tend to be capitalists, but focusing on wealth leads to shallow class politics. You end up making juvenile political jabs against this or that hypocritical figure for being rich. You focus energy on the wrong places. You reduce class consciousness to economic resentment. And whether you're talking about left-wing or right-wing populism, the driving force behind populism seems to be resentment, and it's not about actual class analysis. Although I said I wasn't that interested in giving a definite meaning of class consciousness, I think it's necessary to see some basic components of what it is in order to observe how populism or any other false consciousness falls short. Class consciousness is the awareness of a class, and I'm specifically talking about the proletariat or working class, but the awareness of a class to understand their place in the social economy and understand their relationship to their work. Does populism give workers a greater understanding of their place in the social economy and their relationship to their work? The answer is largely no. Not definitively no, but populism isn't equipped to look at class dynamics as they exist. There's no ideological or philosophical underpinnings to identify proletarians with ordinary people and bourgeoisie with elites. Any discussion of economic power that isn't about the working class and the capitalist class isn't creating a better understanding of the workers' place in the social economy and their relationship to their work. At best, populism is an entry point for people into class consciousness, not the destination. At worst, populism is a tool for reactionary opportunism. Just think about it historically. Segregationists like George Wallace and Lester Maddox used populist rhetoric to pit common white Southerners who were having integration pushed on them by elite outsiders. And that same mentality now drives populists to see BLM protests as manufactured by elite figures like George Soros to upend traditional institutions like police and business, which, being part of the right-wing view of the traditional cultural fabric, are righteous and just forms of authority and thus not the elites. And that's the crux of the problem. Putting aside the fact that populism is ill-defined and malleable and that it doesn't even necessarily address class antagonism, populism, while anti-elite, isn't anti-authoritarian. It doesn't see class antagonism as a struggle of hierarchy. Bosses are a fact of reality. Owners are a fact of reality. There's no better evidence of this than the authoritarianism of MAGA movement figures like Donald Trump, Tucker Carlson, and adjacent populist figures like Saagar and Enjeti. MAGA, the predominant right-wing populist movement of today, is nakedly and comically authoritarian, while being deeply anti-elitist, because the elite is not synonymous with authority. Even for left-wing populists, who do tend to be genuinely concerned with class and other forms of hierarchy, the remedy isn't the working class overthrowing capitalism. It's good government. And while I'm not hysterical about big bad government like right-wingers tend to be, as if government was the only oppressive force out there, it's hard to deny that labor reforms, a progressive tax system, and a larger social safety net backed by the violence and coercion of the state is far from being anti-authoritarian, especially considering we're still only talking about a softening of capitalism instead of its complete overthrow. It's imperative class consciousness be rooted in not just anti-elitism, but more importantly, anti-authoritarianism. If we only concern ourselves with critiquing wealth, status, influence, and pedigree, and don't challenge the foundational justifications for one person to have authority over another, class divides will form in the cracks of any well-meaning reform. Anyway, that's all the time left for this video. Thank you, in solidarity. Take care of yourself and each other.